Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the First Unitarian Congregation of Ottawa. My name is Chris, and I'm pleased to be your worship associate today. Normally, if you'd like more information about FirstU, it is available at our welcome table. But while the FirstU building is closed because of the COVID-19 virus, you can instead contact us through email at welcome@firstunitarianottawa.ca. I repeat, for more info, please email us at welcome@firstunitarianottawa.ca. After this service and other services, our normal hospitality hour has been replaced by a virtual get-together. If you'd like to join us for this hospitality hour on Zoom, you can find out how by checking our weekly email newsletter, the EUU, or you can visit our website, www.firstunitarianottawa.ca. Whatever your heritage, whatever your faith, whomever you love, and however you identify, today you're a part of our spiritual community. Welcome, and we hope you come back often. Although the doors to our building are closed to do our part in preventing the spread of disease, we are still a vibrant congregation with open minds, spirits, and hearts. This morning, I welcome you into my home and into the homes of our music director and this morning's speaker. Thank you for welcoming us into your home. It's a beautiful thing to think that even though we're all in separate places, protecting ourselves and others by staying away from a crowd, here we're together online, listening, connecting, and soon singing. I hope this moment finds you well. A few more announcements. While the building is closed, staff are working remotely and are monitoring emails during usual working hours. Phone calls will be checked less regularly, so if you'd like a quicker response, please use email. Since we aren't seeing each other in person, it's more important than ever to sign up to receive the EUU, our weekly email newsletter, to check our Facebook page and our web page for notices and updates. Our online calendar is as full as ever. Today, we welcome guest speaker Cindy Blackstock, the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. We look forward to Cindy's words later in the service. And now we light the chalice. Gather together with all our beings, with open ears to hear new ideas and perspectives, with open minds to learn what will help us act, with open hands to give what we can, and with open hearts to transform anger into hope. And now let us sing the chalice lighting song.
Chalice, chalice, burning bright, help remind us with your light of how we'd like to live each day, with love and truth helping lead the way.
This morning's Time for All Ages is taken from the book I Am Woman by Lee Miracle. Black robes. Black robe was a new thing. Thus, the girl was there in the green meadow where horses lolled about, clipping grass and enjoying the soft warmth of mother sun. Here, indeed, was something different. Wordlessly, she absorbed its newness. She heard everything Blackrobe said only because her father spoke in the old way. He was careful to repeat Blackrobe's words verbatim, to show respect for the speaker's vision of truth, and to ensure that no misunderstanding or distortion of his words occurred. Then her father answered him. There is only learning and knowledge, Blackrobe. We do not deny our children knowledge. You say that you have teachers who will show my children how to live. Can you not see? Behind me sits my daughter, who is neither blind nor deaf nor imprisoned. She is free to seek knowledge among whomever she chooses to learn from. Her presence among adults indicates her desire to know. Hence, are we not obligated to give her our knowledge whenever she walks among us? You see her. She will have no need of interpreters if we continue to teach her, you and I. What need then has she of this place called school? You say her brothers and she can learn things that we cannot teach them, like medicine, sanitation, housekeeping, and flight. Her old father laughed. When she grows wings and learns to fly, will she also acquire the beauty and sense of freedom of the eagle, the brazenness and wit of raven? Will her eyes see at night like owl? Blackrobe, show me how you fly, and my daughter will fly tomorrow. Then she will have no need of canoes. It takes a long time to build a bridal canoe. You will fill my young men's minds with useless knowledge, Blackrobe. You say my daughter will learn how to be a good Christian wife, to do a thing called read from dead wood leaves. What need has she to be a woman different than what she is, to kill trees and put marks on the dead wood leaves, to remind her of how she must conduct herself? She is not lazy, nor is she forgetful. She is a good girl who will become a good woman. The interpreter interjected, trying to bring depth to Blackrobe's shallow vision of life. He tried to make the father and Blackrobe see each other's point of view, to make them understand there is no disagreement over the value of different and new knowledge, but only a difference in how to learn, at home or far away, with children from many different villages. The girl knew that her father would not relent.
Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out. When I breathe in, I breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love. When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love. When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love. When I breathe in, I'll breathe in peace. When I breathe out, I'll breathe out love. Breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out.
This is the time in the service when we are drawn closer to the heart of love at our center, and hold those both near and far, loved ones and strangers, in our hearts. For those we are thinking of, for joys and concerns. We have a stone for Lisa's new grandchild. Congratulations. We have a stone for Elizabeth and her brother. He suffered a broken hip after a fall during an already long hospital stay. And one last stone to symbolize the joys and sorrows that remain in our hearts and minds. Let us share in a moment of stillness.
Good morning. I'm Anita McLean, Chair of the Global Justice Working Group here at the First Unitarian Congregation. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our speaker, Professor Cindy Blackstock this morning. Cindy is a professor at McGill University School of Social Work, but she's mostly known as the Executive Director of First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. She has over 30 years of experience in working in child welfare and Indigenous children's rights. Through her hard work in this, it has resulted in hundreds of services being provided to First Nations children, youth, and families. She is also the recipient of more than 15 honorary doctorate degrees from various universities. So I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Cindy Blackstock.
Hello everyone, my name is Cindy Blackstock and it's my pleasure to join you from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa to talk about how you can all make a difference for First Nations children. What a lot of people don't know is that the federal government funds services for First Nations children and families on reserves, and the provincial governments fund it for everybody else. And going back to the founding of Canada, the federal government has underfunded those services for First Nations. So basics like water are not guaranteed, schools are underfunded, child welfare is underfunded, basics like early childhood education programs, healthcare, all of those things are underfunded, and that creates a compound weight on the well-being of First Nations children and their families. And it's something we can all be a part of changing. Now, let's just go back to history, since we're talking about the pandemic now, and a lot of people are just at their homes trying to figure out how to socially distance. Well, for First Nations, there was a key whistleblower back in 1904 who really had found that First Nations children in residential schools were being underfunded by healthcare. And that underfunding in healthcare by the federal government was resulting in unbelievable death rates due to tuberculosis. Now, you can see here, it was Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce who was the person who pointed this out. He was a chief medical health officer at the time in the federal public service. And he said that about, 25% of kids in every school for each year would be dead. And for one school, there was 69% of the ex-pupils were dead. He said if you equalized out the funding for healthcare, and you made sure that there were proper healthcare practices such as social distancing, not putting sick kids in with healthy kids, many of the same things that are being recommended for COVID today, that you could save a lot of those children's lives. Well, the federal government did a calculation and really found out that the cost of Dr. Bryce's reforms was about $10,000 to $15,000. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, whoa, that's a lot of money back then, and you'd be right, except for the fact that the federal treasury was operating at about $100 million back then. So really, even back then, this was a drop in the bucket. So what did the government do with these scientific recommendations to save children's lives? Well, they said no. The results were released under Prime Minister Laurier, and Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the senior public official at the time in the federal service overlooking the residential school file, just said, no, we're not implementing Dr. Bryce's reforms. And in fact, several years later, he would make attendance at the school mandatory, even though the health conditions had not been remedied. Meanwhile, Dr. Scott was being lauded in society for his work as a Confederate poet. And he even served as president of the Royal Society, which many of you know is the preeminent academic organization. And he won 2 honorary doctorate degrees. What happened with Dr. Bryce? Well, the federal government didn't like one of their own speaking out against the government's inaction. So they punished him and they actually erased him from Canadian history books. Now, this is very, Dr. Bryce in some ways is very akin to another social justice advocate that many of you will be familiar with. And that, of course, is Jesus Christ. He was one of the very first people to really stand up in resistance for human rights and to be seen by many as a troublemaker back then. but he was really striving for justice, and we can't forget that. You know, sometimes we think, oh, well, you know, pushing the federal government to do something is political. And it is political because these politicians are able to make these changes, but it's not partisan. And I think in that way that this is something that's very akin to theology. Theology would not endorse, Christ would not have stood silent and still as children were racially discriminated against by the public service. It's just unthinkable. So I see a lot of synergies from what I understand the Christian faith to be and the work of Dr. Bryce. Now, one of the things to understand is when we see the landscape of issues regarding First Nations, so lack of water, their predisposition for more health concerns, underfunding of education, we start to think, well, maybe we need studies to think that through. But the reality is we know what the solutions are. They've been documented through the ages. And the federal government has these solutions on the books. What needs to be done is the federal government needs to act on these recommendations, not study them, not create a plan to do it, but actually do these things. And this is really important, of course, because they push back the date of releasing a plan for the Murdered Missing Indigenous Women and Girls report. And we don't even know when that's going to be coming out. But unfortunately, women and girls are continuing to go missing. So that would be your number one action item, is to get a hold of your member of parliament and say, hey, you need to get acting on these recommendations because people's lives literally are at stake. Now, when we look at the question of children, and this is all children, not just First Nations children, we're just going to switch the lens a little bit and look at all kids. Canada is a very poor performer when it comes to respecting children's rights. Every year, a group called the Kids' Rights Index releases a worldwide ranking of countries about how well they're doing for children proportionate to their wealth. So we would expect wealthy countries like Canada to be at the top of the pack. But in fact, we're not at the top of the pack. We're 52nd in the world. And that was as of 2018. We just got the 2020 report, and we've actually slipped 2 spaces. So we're now 54th in the world. What hasn't changed is we're still at 138th in the world in the child rights environment. Why is that index important? Well, that is ranks how much money governments are investing in children proportionate to their GDP, and also how much attention they're giving to kids in legislation. And you can see here that our ranking is really quite abysmal, 138th in the world. So Canada can be doing better and ought to be doing better, because the best investment any government can make is in children. It's not in people my age or, you know, I'm close to being a senior citizen. It's definitely not rate of return on me. It's rate of return on kids on an economic point of view, but also, of course, for a moral point of view, is you're raising a generation of children who can have that life that they wish to have and will be making contributions to society throughout their lives as healthy people. Now, remember I was talking about all those reports? Well, a lot of those reports were on First Nations child welfare. We've heard about the overrepresentation of First Nations children in care. What a lot of people don't know is it's fueled by the inequitable housing, by deep levels of poverty on reserve, which is linked to inequitable education, and of course in colonial thinking around lack of economic opportunities. And then the third factor it's linked to is caregiver mental health and addictions issues, which of course go together. When you have mental health issues, you're more likely to fall into addictions patterns as a way of coping. And those 3 factors are what drive it. The good news is those are all responsive to interventions. The bad news is, like other public services on reserve, the federal government has chronically underfunded it. And in fact, we know from at least the last 20 years that the federal government was consciously underfunding these services. And that was resulting in dramatic increases in First Nations children being separated from their families unnecessarily. So we worked with the government. When I say we, the Assembly of First Nations and the Caring Society, worked with the government for over 10 years, documenting economic solutions to remedy these inequalities for kids. But the government didn't do anything. So back in 2007, we filed a human rights complaint against the federal government, alleging that their inequitable provision of services was racial discrimination against children. So that case, we thought, well, they're going to come to their senses as soon as we file it, because the evidence was overwhelming that that inequality was there. The government even acknowledged in its own documents it was there. But they didn't fight it on evidence. They fought it on legal technicalities. And so it took us from 2007 to 2016 to get a ruling, because they tried repeated motions to get it kicked out on jurisdictional grounds. Thankfully, they weren't successful. So the tribunal issued its ruling in 2016 as a historic one, because it's the only example where a government has gone in front of a judicial body with the power to hold it to orders for this generation of kids, not an apology or remedy of what happened in the past, but to actually make a difference for this generation of kids and ones to come. And the tribunal said that, yes, Canada is racially discriminating against 165,000 children. Yes, Canada had the solutions, just like with Dr. Bryce, and yes, Canada chose not to implement them. And that lack of implementation resulted in unnecessary family separations of thousands of people. And we need not know how traumatic that is. We need not wonder about it anyway, because we've already seen what happened in residential schools from unnecessarily separating kids. Well, it's happening again, and the Canadian government is choosing to do it. I need to underscore that issue of choice. It is very important. And it's not a matter of just my opinion, it's a matter of legal fact. And the Canadian government has not appealed this decision, meaning that they accept the decision. A key part of the decision was Jordan's Principle. And Jordan's Principle is meant to ensure that First Nations children receive public services they need when they need them, free of any discrimination because they're First Nations. It's named after Jordan River Anderson from Norway House Cree Nation. Jordan was born in 1999, and he had some medical issues in the hospital for 2 years, but he ought to have been discharged when he was 2 years old. If he was any other child than a First Nations child, he would have been discharged to a family home. But because he was First Nations, the federal government thought, well, I guess we have to pay for him because he's a First Nations kid and we do fund First Nations services. But then they couldn't figure out what department should fund it. Should it be Health Canada? Should it be Indian Affairs? And of course, they wanted the province of Manitoba to pick up some of the costs. So these governments sat at a table and they decided, well, we don't want to risk setting up a precedent of funding a service that maybe another level of government should pick up. So our decision is to leave Jordan in the hospital while we figure out who should fund his at-home care. And they argued over each item individually. Well, this poor little child stays in the hospital waiting for over 2.5 years while governments argued, before, as his sister Geraldine Anderson says, Jordan dies of a broken heart by slipping into a coma just before his 5th birthday and passing shortly after. Jordan River Anderson never left the hospital, never lived in a family home because of racial discrimination by the federal government and the province of Manitoba. So in his memory, the family created Jordan's Principle, and it passed unanimously in the House of Commons in 2007. That should have been the end of these types of tragedies, but it wasn't. The federal government constructed a definition so narrow that no child ever qualified, even though cases that were devastating were coming forward to the federal government. One I remember is a 4-year-old little girl who is healthy, but she went into surgery and something went wrong. And she ends up really in a very critical medical situation just before Christmas and needs a hospital bed so that she can go home for the holidays and not suffocate. That request goes through 15 different public servants before someone writes on there, absolutely not, they're not going to pay for it. And in around that same time period, the deputy minister of the Department of Indian Affairs gives the people who are saying no to these kids, like this 4-year-old, the top award in the public service. So racial discrimination, this failure to observe Jordan's Principle, wasn't just normative in the public service, it was award-winning. So thankfully, the tribunal found that Canada had to implement Jordan's principle. And so now there is a 24-hour line for families to call who are in need. Now, these can be First Nations kids on or off reserve, as well as Inuit kids. And those are the phone numbers there. And just to give you an example of the depth of the discrimination, this last year, the federal government have had to provide over 250,000 products and services for First Nations kids that they otherwise would not have received had that discrimination continued. Now, this is Spirit Bear, and actually he was our mascot, for lack of a better word, at the tribunal. When we first went to hearings in 2007, the courtrooms were antiseptic and cold, and I didn't want any of us to forget why we were there, which was the children. So we're gifted this teddy bear by Carrier Sakani Family and Children's Services in Prince George, British Columbia. And we decided we'd bring them along to all the hearings. And by 2009, children were coming to the hearings. They heard about the unfairness, but they, unlike adults who often didn't learn anything about residential schools or about these inequalities in school, this generation of children was learning, and they couldn't see any excuse for why children who were First Nations would receive less than what they received. So they would be coming into the courtroom in droves. In fact, so many kids came by 2012 that we had to book them in shifts. And they would go into the courtroom, and of course, they were thrilled that Spirit Bear was there. And they would take him and they would send him back with fan mail and sunglasses. And eventually he accumulated a whole wardrobe, and he became a reconciliation ambassador. So he was there to educate and support the children in their reconciliation actions. And he's also got a bunch of credentials now. He's got a barrister certificate from Osgoode Law School. He's been admitted to the bar by the Indigenous Bar Association. And he's got an annual calendar where every month there's something free that individuals or groups, such as persons in the faith community, can do to promote the TRC's calls to action for absolutely free. And they're all based on love, and they're all based on things that are fun and easy to do. It says here he's the author of 2 children's books, but he's actually the author of 3, and there's one coming out in the next few months. So you can go and see his books, and we're also working on animated feature. Those are some of the books, and as you can see, they all come with learning guides when we translate them into English and French, and we also translate them into First Nations languages. The books are available at Chapters. Sorry, this is dated. It's not Fitzhenry anymore. Chapters or on Amazon. And all the proceeds for these books go to children's reconciliation projects. And we only sell the French and English versions. The First Nations versions we make available for free. And in fact, we have the English and French versions of Spirit Bear's first book, Spirit Bear and Children Make History, which tells the story of the tribunal, available free online to families as they're doing their online learning during the COVID crisis. Another thing we have are reconciliation ambassadors. So children and organizations and workplaces can ask to host one of our bears. We have quite a few bears. You can see there's a grizzly bear. We have a lot of them. And we send them out with that calendar we talked about, Spirit Bear's calendar. And what you do is when you receive the bear, you have to include the bear in doing each of those activities every month. And then let Spirit Bear know what you're doing in your community to promote reconciliation. There's another piece to this, and that is that you work with your local Indigenous community to have a naming ceremony for your bear with the children so that they learn about that particular culture, and that the children are encouraged to read books to the teddy bear in the First Nations language or Métis language or Inuit language. So these ambassadors are all over the world. There's one as far away as Australia, and they're around Canada. Many schools have them, youth groups have them. You can have one too. Just go onto our website and check out our ambassador program. Another key thing we do is honoring memories, planting dreams, and that is for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It's celebrated in May and June, and what we do is we ask people to make a heart in memory of one of the children that Dr. Bryce tried to save in residential schools. that passed away there. And you make that heart as a part of your honoring the memory. And then the actual planting, you put it on a planting stake and you plant it. And that's your commitment to the TRC's calls to action. Spirit Bear has a child-friendly version of the TRC's calls to action on the website that you can download for children in your families or in your faith group and circulate those along. We also have all kinds of other free activities that you can do to create your own heart gardens, but also throughout the year, free events that you can do even in your family home so that they're COVID safe. We have a children's edition of a journal, and we publish it every once in a while, every couple of years, where all the submissions are produced by children and youth, and there's a child and youth editorial board. So they're in touch with all proceeds and all the processes regarding publication of peer-reviewed journals. We're going to have another one come out this year on First Nations education, inspired by the great First Nations education activist Shannon Kustachin. So you can check it out there, and our kids' versions tend to be even most well-read compared to some of our adult submissions. And you can also, thanks to Ellen Iso-Bomsawin, who is an Abenaki filmmaker with the National Film Board, find all kinds of films about the various campaigns of the Caring Society that she's produced as documentaries. So a couple of examples are Hi Ho Mr. Hay, which is about Shannon Kustachin and her dream for safe and comfy schools in First Nations communities. We Can't Make the Same Mistake Twice, which is about the actual tribunal, brings you into the tribunal room so you can see the government lawyers, our lawyers, all the kids that came. And that one is actually available on the National Film Board website free of charge. So you can get on there now during COVID when you're safely staying in your home to protect others. You can watch these films free of charge. There's also another one called Jordan River Anderson, The Messenger, which is about Jordan's principle. That will be available free of charge on the NFB website beginning in September. So just mark that in your calendars and you'll be able to watch it. Now, the final thing, we started with the conversation between two men of their respective period, Dr. Bryce and Duncan Campbell Scott. Both of them were in conversation with one another. Dr. Bryce was morally courageous, and he was erased from Canadian history for his activism and for his standing up for the right thing. Whereas Dr. Scott was lauded really for what amounts to moral cowardice. In fact, in the closest thing to a lament is John Malloy, the author of a great history book I recommend you all read called A National Crime, which takes its title from Bryce's work, says that Scott wrote to his editor shortly before he died and said, "I've never done anything courageous in my entire life." He was celebrated in Canadian history. So what happened since then? Well, both of them, it turns out, are buried in Beechwood Cemetery, which is Canada's national cemetery, not far from where I am right now. And we worked with the cemetery, the TRC, and with John Malloy, the historian, and with the educators from Project of Heart. And what we did is we created historical plaques for something called Reconciling History. So you can go to Beechwood and plant your own heart at Dr. Bryce's grave and say thank you and be inspired by his example. You can also go over and visit Duncan Campbell Scott and really acknowledge the good things he did, but learn from the lasting legacy of harm that his choices left. And another person buried there is Nicholas Flood Davin. Nicholas Flood Davin is the author of the Davin Report, which was commissioned by John A. Macdonald himself. And he sent Davin down to Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania to see how these things operated, these industrial schools, which later became residential schools. And Davin came back for the report recommending they be implemented, and then they prospered all over Canada. All that research that went into the plaques, and we were very clear about balancing them. So it's not just that they're evildoers, because if they're evildoers, then they're not teachers. People just say, oh, well, I'm not like them. They're a bad apple. I'm not a bad apple. What we wanted to show is it really is about the choices we make, whether or not we actually live in coherence with values and human rights and dignity. And Dr. Bryce chose to do that. So he shows that strength. But then we show the other side of the human fragile condition. And our tendency sometimes to reward those people instead of offering a course correction in their life circumstances. And that's what I think we need to do with Canada too right now. So we took all of that material and we created children's curriculum out of it, thanks with Project of Heart and with the BC Teachers Federation. So you can go online and look at all of the material, that historical material, which is now being taught to children and young people all over Canada. And there are 7 free ways for you to help make a difference on our website. We're really aware that many people care and want to do something, but they just don't know what to do. So we have 7 free ways that anyone can do to make a difference in under 2 minutes. And the other thing I would recommend you do is get a hold of your members of parliament and really encourage them to implement something called the Spirit Bear Plan, named after Spirit Bear, of course. And basically, it's a plan to end all the inequalities that First Nations experience. You ever notice that the federal government say, well, we're making a plan to deal with water, but they don't have a plan to deal with inequalities in, say, early childhood education. So let's figure out what the shortfalls are across all those programs and create something like a Marshall Plan and then deal with it. We've seen from the money that's been spent on COVID, and it needed to be spent there, but that it was always possible for the federal government to remedy these inequalities. And we also have seen through Bryce's story that it's not okay for Prime Minister after Prime Minister to be calling on First Nations children to be patient living with their discrimination when they've already endured it for at least 113 years. Now is the time to get it right. You can help make a difference, just as I'm pretty sure that man up on the cross would have done. So thank you very much for your time, and I wish you really well.
This is the time in our service that we usually accept the offering. You can go to our website or contact our finance manager to find out how you could keep up with your pledge or make a donation during these times. We give these gifts freely. We receive these gifts gratefully. We dedicate these gifts to the work of our congregation, serving human wholeness, caring for the planet, upholding religious freedom, welcoming the stranger, loving one another. For our closing words, I'll share this quote from George Barna. If you want to have a lasting influence upon the world, you must invest in people's lives. And if you want to maximize that investment, then you must invest in those people when they are young. Let us sing Spirit of Light.